Well, it's that time that we've all been waiting for. It's time for me to try to explain the history, or the family tree, I suppose, if you prefer, of the X-Men. There are years and years of history and thousands of comics at this point, spanning across multiple series and in some cases, multiple universes. So of course, I can't necessarily fit every little tiny detail in this video, but I am going to do my best to give you an overview of the general evolution of the X-Men from the 1960s to modern day. And trust me, I've seen some other content there on YouTube, and I'm trying to give you guys the most detailed that I can in the time that I have. We only have so much time, so without further ado, I'm your host Amanda, and this is me attempting to explain the entirety of the X-Men. Woo! To really understand this team, we have to go all the way back to their humble beginnings over at Marvel Comics. The team supposedly came to be thanks to a group you're quite familiar with. No, I'm not talking about Marvel, and no, I'm not talking about legendary duo Jack Kirby and Stan Lee. I'm talking about us, the fans. Well, I mean, not me specifically, as I was not alive back in 1963, but the fans who were around back then and reading comics had a need for more Marvel team books. There were many solo hero books out there, but fans wanted to see more team-ups. And so Stan Lee and Jack Kirby came up with the X-Men. Stan Lee had said before that the challenge with team books where new characters were introduced was explaining how they all got their powers, their origins. To simplify this, he had an idea of making the entire team a group of mutants, using that same blanketed reason to explain how they each got their powers. Pretty easy, you can just say, hey, they're mutants. The brilliance of this is that while on paper this sounds like an easy, even lazier approach to some, it actually worked. A huge part of the reason why the X-Men were so successful and why we love them even today is because of their mutant status. Initially, Stan wanted to give them a simple name, denoting this status, the Mutants. But publisher Martin Goodman turned down the name idea, citing the fact that no one knew what a mutant was. Some even believed that the name, the Mutants, could still be used as a good alternative name for the group when they debut in the MCU, but we'll have to wait to find out about that. Instead, Lee decided to take inspiration for the team's name from their leader and mentor, Professor X, calling them simply the X-Men. In those early comics created by Kirby and Lee, Professor Charles Xavier, or Professor X, as he'd come to be more commonly known, created a school for young mutants, guided by a dream of peaceful coexistence with humankind. You see, the public was not a fan of mutants, and there were many evil mutants out there that gave mutant kind a bad rap. To combat this, Professor X decided to create a school for gifted youngsters in Westchester County, New York, bringing together a team of young mutants using his telepathic abilities and Cerebro, which we later learned was actually created by X and his future student Jean Grey. The initial team and group of students that started it all were Cyclops, Beast, Angel, Iceman, and of course, Jean Grey as Marvel Girl. During these early days, they were also sometimes joined by Mimic, who initially was introduced as a deadly villain that could adopt the abilities and powers of those around him, making him a formidable foe for the X-Men, as he could, mimic all of their powers. However, Mimic would soon after be reformed, and after losing and regaining his powers kind of multiple times, would also end up adopting the OG X-Men roster's power sets permanently. These were the early days of the X-Men, which also introduced one of their greatest enemies, who coincidentally would also throughout the years become somewhat reformed before becoming a full-on anti-hero, or even to some, a full-on hero in modern day comics, Magneto, the master of magnetism, and his also quite infamous Brotherhood of Evil Mutants, who themselves would have many various different versions and rosters throughout the years. Eventually, the X-Men series was taken over by Roy Thomas, beginning with issue number 20. Throughout the continuation of the series, other writers would also help out, and we'd see characters like Havoc, Cyclops' heroically reluctant brother, who was also a mutant, and Polaris, who we later learned was the daughter of Magneto, having powers similar to him, introduced. This series would be ongoing until issue number 66, where it would come to a firm stop as sales dwindled somewhat. Up until issue 93 of the series, the X-Men title would only exist to sell reprints of older stories. So there's a period there where nothing new is really happening, it's just a lot of reprints. However, with Giant Size X-Men issue number 1, we'd see X-Men return in a big way, finally getting a new tale and ultimately a revival. Len Wein and Dave Cockrum were the creatives behind this first Giant Size, which would become a Marvel and X-Men staple. In fact, recently in 2020, we saw a new Giant Size X-Men series emerge in this similar vein. Each issue of that series focusing on a story tied to a different X-Men. In the first ever Giant Size X-Men issue number 1 though, a whole new team of X-Men were introduced, featuring Colossus, Wolverine, Storm, Thunderbird, Banshee, Nightcrawler, and Sunfire. Oh, and Cyclops was also there. Although it should be noted, as I talk about the evolution of the roster, I likely won't mention all members every single time to avoid repetition. I'm also not going to mention every single roster because I could just do that in one video and that could be a whole video. Suffice it to say, there have been a lot of X-Men rosters that Scott Summers has been a part of as well. If he's not mentioned, he might still be on there. The difference between this team and the original X-Men team was that this team was a lot more grown up. The former youngsters had all grown up and this team reflected that, with all new members also being adults as opposed to teens. The Giant Size roster was also unique in that each team member was radically different from the other, having a completely different background, power set, and in many cases even country of origin. This was probably the first roster to really reflect another trait many fans love about the X-Men today: diversity. In terms of the why behind this team, they were brought together to rescue the original X-Men from the deadly sentient mutant island known as Krakoa, currently actually an ally to the X-Men in modern day comics, but once a villain in their history. Technically wedged in between this rescue attempt and when the X-Men ended up in peril was another team initially led by Moira McTaggart, but outside of the canon in real-world comic history, this team wouldn't be retconned into existence until the early 2000s. It would serve to help introduce the youngest Summers brother, the quote-unquote mystery Summers bro, Vulcan. But back to the Giant Size team. They were successful in their rescue mission and afterwards were left to ask the question, now that all the X-Men were safe and sound, new and old, what are we going to do with 13 X-Men? Well, they wouldn't have to worry about this too much as they weren't lucky number 13 for too long. Shortly afterwards, Sunfire left the team in a huff, Thunderbird died on a mission unfortunately, Iceman and Angel ultimately moved out of the X-Mansion, and Havoc and Polaris decided to go back to school. Jean Grey as well also left for a period, kind of returning to school, but her romantic connection to Scott Summers kept her mostly active on the team's roster. Jean would also eventually become the Phoenix, sending us down a path towards one of the most iconic X-Men stories I would say of all time, the Phoenix Saga, and of course the even more iconic follow-up story, the Dark Phoenix Saga. While the adult X-Men team continued on, there were newer mutants introduced and a second X-Men title was added to make room for them and their stories. This new young team of teen mutants had a book whose title reflected just what they were, the New Mutants, in a way calling back to the simplicity of the title Stan Lee had originally thought up. This era is often considered one of the best among fans, with creative team Chris Claremont and John Byrne often standing out as the main folks we think of when we reflect back on these iconic moments and stories. In addition to the Phoenix Saga, there was also Days of Future Past and God Loves, Man Kills. Many of the stories you've seen brought to life in film and animated series adaptations are actually taken from this time period in mutant and X-Men history. Another spin-off title was added at this time to showcase the tales of the original X-Men roster, the most classic of teams. However, because we already had an X-Men team and title, this book and the team within its pages would become known instead as XFactor. At that time, XFactor was the old roster returning to action, not yet a mutant detective agency. Despite being what most fans associate with that name now, that version of XFactor actually wouldn't become known to us until the early 2000s, with XFactor Investigations making its first appearance in Madrox issue number 1 in 2004, which led into the 2005 XFactor series, which is technically volume 3 of that series. Even more books would be added to what seemed to be developing as somewhat of an X-Men line, I would say. Excalibur appeared as part of Marvel UK's collection of comics. This comic featured 3 X-Men, Nightcrawler, Kitty Pryde, and Rachel Summers, who teamed up on adventures with Marvel UK superheroes Brian Braddock's Captain Britain and Megan. By the time we got to the 80s, we had a completely new roster of X-Men who were featured in in the Uncanny X-Men title, which actually is considered to be a renamed portion of the X-Men Legacy series. This new roster featured Storm, Wolverine, Colossus, Rogue, Psylocke, Dazzler, Longshot, and Havoc, among others. Angel, Nightcrawler, Polaris, Banshee, and Kitty Pryde's Sprite were also present, as was Professor X. This era featured one of my favorite X-Men story epics, Inferno. While the 80s were a pretty magical time for X-Men stories, the party came crashing to a halt somewhat in issue number 251 of Uncanny X-Men, when the team split up! Of course, no cliffhanger here for us living in the retrospective future, as we know the X-Men would and did return. In issue number 254, a new team revealed themselves, coming together on Muir Island, nearby to Scotland. This roster was made up of both mutants and humans, featuring Banshee, Polaris, Forge, Dr. Moira McTaggart, Professor X's son, Legion, Nightcrawler's magical foster sister and also romantic love interest, Amanda Sefton, Brigadier Sandy Stewart, who belonged to the Weird Happenings organization, aka WHO, Tom Corsi, Sharon Friedlander, and very briefly, Sunder. This mutant team is often referred to as the Muir Island X-Men. We were also introduced to supporting characters like the Muir Island Morlocks, including Callisto and Healer, and the Freedom Force, which initially featured Destiny, Mystique, and Valerie Cooper, but would kind of become like an alternate Brotherhood roster, to be honest. The core X-Men team, however, would stay pretty much broken up until issue number 270, when all mutants were brought together once more in Extinction Agenda to fight against the cyborg Cameron Hodge. Possibly one of the most famed X-Men creative teams of all time, started to sort out the current state of the X-Men and their fractured rosters as we moved into the 90s. Jim Lee and Chris Claremont. In issue number 273, we got a story called appropriately, Too Many Mutants. Truer words were never spoken, which aimed to rectify all the confusion by finally giving us a new X-Men roster featuring Storm, Wolverine, Psylocke, Jubilee, Gambit, Forge, and Banshee. By 1991, we saw the many mutants coming together once more to take on the evil psionic mastermind known as the Shadow King during the Muir Island saga. After that battle, however, we were once more left with the remnants of three teams all kind of jumbled together: the Muir Island X-Men, the X-Men X-Men, and XFactor. Once again, at the end of XFactor issue number 70, we were left with the question, this time asked by Professor X, what am I going to do with 14 X-Men? No one looks pleased either about this issue on the page where this question is asked, perhaps because they are all upset that Professor X has maybe forgotten them, as he seems to have miscounted, but I assume this is just supposed to be a play on the 13 and we're just one-upping it, because there's definitely people that are not included in that count, including some who are not pictured here, and you know, Professor X himself. There were likely even more than 14 X-Men now gathered. The solution to this question finally came in the form of creating multiple actual X-Men teams. Not spin-offs, but instead two main rosters. This is where the much-loved original X-Men Gold and Blue rosters come in, and this love is in fact proven by sales, with Jim Lee and Chris Claremont's X-Men issue number 1 being known as the best-selling comic of all time. At the time of this recording, there have been a reported over 8 million copies sold, which is pretty wild. The blue team featured Cyclops as leader, with Gambit, Rogue, Beast, Psylocke, Wolverine, and Jubilee rounding out the team's ranks, and briefly featuring Revanche as well. The blue team featured more of the edgy and newer X-Men characters, and was written and drawn by Chris Claremont and Jim Lee. Featured in the pages of the second volume of X-Men from 1991, starting of course with issue number 1, although they wouldn't actually be the blue team until like a few issues later, in terms of like them just being the mainstay. Think about issue 4. The gold team, on the other hand, featured Storm as leader, with members including Colossus, Angel's Archangel, Bishop, Jean, Forge, and Iceman. This team was depicted as the more seasoned and experienced one, showcasing more of the classic X-Men of the 60s and 70s. This team's stories were told in the pages of Uncanny X-Men, kicking off with issue number 281 of the series. I personally love this cover. The creative team involved included John Byrne, Jim Lee, and Wilchi Portacio. The costumes showcased with both teams, designed by Jim Lee, became pretty iconic and served to inspire their looks in the 90s X-Men animated series. To this day, they're still my favorite X-Men suits. The 90s was also the time that we were introduced to the mutant Black Ops team X-Force, who initially started out as kinda like time-traveling assassins made up of the former New Mutants team, who are now being led by big gun-toting time-traveling son of Madeline Pryor, Scott Summers, and sort of Jean Grey, prey from the future, Cable. XFactor would also continue as a government-funded team led by Havoc and Polaris, and despite the fact that the two mainstay teams were introduced to help simplify the murkiness created by having simply too many characters, the 90s is actually where it gets somehow even more confusing. Despite each team being somewhat tied to a specific X-Men title, these titles both had X-Men in the name, and often stories unfolded and were woven through multiple series, meaning you needed to collect multiple titles to get the whole story. While this can be fun at the time of collecting, it can also be exhausting, and expensive, and confusing to figure out when you're returning back to older stories. Both teams actually lived in the X-Mansion, but simply went on separate missions. Starting in 1993 with Uncanny X-Men issue 298 and X-Men issue number 17, the teams also started to swap members for certain missions, making everything even more confusing for readers to try to discern between the two once very distinct rosters. During this era, however, we did get many memorable and character-defining stories, including Fatal Attractions, Phalanx Covenant, and the Onslaught event. But by 1994, the terms blue and gold had kinda lost all meaning, with both teams pretty much melding together. By 1998, the roster had shrunk down to 8 core members, including Wolverine, Storm, Nightcrawler, Colossus, Kitty Pryde, Rogue, Gambit, and Marrow, surprisingly, with stories featuring the team continuing to weave back and forth between Uncanny X-Men and the X-Men series, starting with issue number 360 and issue number 80, respectively. Since the 90s, there have been a slew of other important stories as we moved into the 2000s and beyond, including the alternate timeline Ultimate X-Men, E is for Extinction, House of M and M-Day, Messiah Complex and Messiah War, Schism, Avengers vs. X-Men, Inhumans vs. X-Men, and Resurrection. There have also been countless X-Men books featuring multiple teams, many of which simply refer to themselves as the X-Men, even when a mainstay X-Men book was also already ongoing alongside them, which means we get a lot of stories, but also making sense of the X-Men roster gets more and more confusing. These titles have included The Amazing X-Men, The Astonishing X-Men, Extreme X-Men, New X-Men, which was the mainstay at the time, known as the Grant Morrison era of X-Men, X-Men Legacy, Young X-Men, Wolverine in the X-Men, which is actually one of my favorites, All New X-Men, which featured the time-displaced OG X-Men, X-Men Gold, Spider-Man in the X-Men, Extraordinary X-Men, the 2017 relaunch of Blue and Gold teams with X-Men Blue and X-Men Gold. And then of course, there were all the books that were simply known as Uncanny X-Men and X-Men, including one volume of the series simply titled X-Men from 2015 that features an all-female roster of mutants led by Storm that I feel like no one really ever talks about for some reason. I still can't believe how seemingly quiet the hype surrounding that series was, and I know that not a lot of people were super here for it, but also, what a cool team! I suppose it all pretty much goes to show you that by the 2010s, people were pretty much overwhelmed with X-Men content, with the mutant hype receding for some time. To give you some more perspective here, despite the initial X-Men series being consistently returned to, sometimes renamed, but often maintaining or returning to actual legacy numbering, we are still also on the 6th volume of the X-Men title with the 2021 series. Pretty crazy to think, considering how long some of those other series went on for. The modern age, however, has seen a great boost to X-Men popularity, and I have to say I feel lucky to be one of the folks reading along through this entire era. In 2019, Jonathan Hickman and Pepe Larraz became the main creative team behind House of X and Powers of 10, which kicked off the era of X-Men we are in now, which I like to refer to as the Krakoan era. This has been a 3-part multi-year saga that is still ongoing, spanning a number of series in the double digits. The 3 major acts of this epic can be divided between Dawn of X, Reign of X, and Fall of X. Events have included one of my all-time favorites, Ten of Swords, the Marvel-wide crossover AXE Judgment Day or Axe, and SOS, aka Sins of Sinister, as well as recurring yearly Hellfire galas, which we can all dress up and attend in our minds. However, the X-Men history and family will continue on as the Krakoa era is soon coming to a close, with 2023's Hellfire Gala being advertised as the last. My heart. And here we are in the present, where I'm excited to see where the end of this era takes us, although it will be sad to say farewell and close the book on this amazing chapter in X-Men history. What are your favorite X-Men eras and tales? Let us know in the comments. Until next time, you stay nerdy, YouTube. Bye.